On a cold February morning in 1863, Thomas Brennan stepped off the stagecoach in Chatham County, South Carolina, into a world that did not want him there. He was the newly appointed county sheriff, a position he had earned through the patronage of a Northern military officer who believed in Reconstruction and the possibility of justice in a South that seemed entirely opposed to both. Brennan was 47 years old, a former constable from Philadelphia, with a reputation for integrity that was equal parts respected and resented. He was the kind of man whose face suggested he had witnessed difficult things and had not looked away from them. His beard, once dark, had started to gray at the edges. He wore his gun as sheriffs did, but with the bearing of a man who hoped never to fire it. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and they observed Chatham County with the intensity of someone attempting to read a text written in a language he did not quite understand. The town itself, Riverside as it was called, contained perhaps 2,000 souls arranged around a courthouse that had been burned during the war and rebuilt without enthusiasm. The streets were red clay, perpetually muddy. The buildings bore that particular weariness of the post-war South, where the conflict had passed like a destructive wind, leaving behind prosperity turned to rust and accumulated resentment. Brennan had been given a single room above the general store to serve as his office. He had been told, in language both polite and clearly threatening, that he was welcome to enforce the law regarding common criminals and civil disputes, but that he should not involve himself in local traditions or established arrangements. He understood what this meant. It meant do not investigate too deeply into what happened to people who disappeared. It meant do not ask uncomfortable questions about how certain properties had come to be abandoned, or why whole families had simply ceased to exist. It meant look the other way. Brennan had become a sheriff precisely because he could not look the other way. For the first 2 weeks of his tenure, he handled the work that was expected of him. A man was caught stealing from a merchant and was arrested. A dispute over property boundaries was adjudicated. A woman reported her husband missing, and Brennan conducted a cursory investigation that led nowhere and ended in a presumption of voluntary abandonment. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of wariness and contempt. He was a Northerner. He was an agent of a government they despised. He was a man attempting to impose order on a society that had built itself on the very concept of systematic disorder, the fundamental disorder of enslaving human beings and treating them as property rather than as people. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 16 days after his arrival, that the first piece of the puzzle appeared. A man came to his office, a farmer named Edgar Hutchins, who worked land approximately 5 miles north of Riverside. Hutchins was nervous in the way of men who have decided to do something dangerous and have not quite committed to the decision. He kept looking over his shoulder. He kept glancing at the door. He held his hat in his hands and turned it repeatedly, as though seeking reassurance from its familiar fabric. "There's something on the property?" Hutchins said finally, the words coming out in a rush, as though, if he did not speak them quickly enough, he might lose his nerve entirely. "I've been trying to ignore it. The previous owner, Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge, he kept that portion of the land fenced off. I inherited the property from my cousin, and the fence was still there, and I was told in no uncertain terms by certain gentlemen of the community that it would be best if I left that fence exactly where it was and did not attempt to venture into that enclosure." Brennan leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was careful and measured. "What did you find, Mr. Hutchins?" "Graves," Hutchins said. The word hung in the air between them like something tangible, something with weight and historical consequence. "I found graves, dozens of them, perhaps more. Some are old. The ground has settled completely over them, but some look fresher, more recent, and they're only women. I dug around carefully, trying to understand what I was looking at, and I found fragments, cloth, hair, and in one location I found a ring, a woman's ring, with a name inscribed inside it. Sarah, just the single name Sarah. Brennan's hand went to a small notebook he kept on his desk. He opened it without hurrying. He wrote nothing yet. Instead, he asked the question that would eventually unravel everything. "How many graves are there, Mr. Hutchins?" Hutchins swallowed hard. "I counted approximately 47 distinct grave sites, but the ground is so disturbed in some locations that I could not be entirely certain. There could be more. There could be 50 or even 60. All I know is that if you go north from my property line about 200 yards, you'll find an area that's been fenced in for a very long time, and that area contains the remains of women who died under circumstances that someone with significant power decided should not be documented, investigated, or acknowledged. Brennan's face did not change. His expression remained neutral and professional, though inside him, something shifted fundamentally. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern. The warnings he had been given, the careful instructions not to investigate certain matters, the casual references to people who had left the area, or moved north, or run away. He had attributed these disappearances to the chaos of the war years. Now he understood that he had been deliberately misled. These disappearances were not chaos. They were systematic. They were organized. They were hidden through deliberate community effort. "I need you to take me to this location," Brennan said, standing. "Today, immediately if possible." Hutchins' face went pale. "Sheriff, I appreciate your willingness to investigate, but I need to tell you something important. The men who warned me, they were not subtle about the warning. They made clear that any attempt to interfere with that property would result in consequences for my family. I have a wife. I have 3 children. When I came here this morning, I did so against her wishes. She begged me not to tell anyone about the graves. She said that some things are better left undisturbed." Brennan walked to the window of his office and looked out at the street below. Nothing had changed in appearance. The same shops remained open. The same people walked the same routes. But everything had changed in his understanding. He had been looking at Chatham County and seeing only the surface. The aftermath of war, the attempt to rebuild, the normal functioning of a rural community. Now he understood that he had been looking at something far more sinister. He turned back to face Hutchins. "Mr. Hutchins," he said, "I cannot force you to show me the graves. That decision must remain yours. But I want you to understand something clearly. If what you are telling me is true, if there are indeed dozens of unmarked graves containing the remains of women, then someone in this county has committed murders. Multiple murders. Murders that have been concealed through systematic intimidation and fear. As the sheriff of Chatham County, it is my responsibility to investigate such crimes. I will conduct this investigation with or without your assistance. But with your assistance, the investigation will be easier, the investigation will be faster, and most importantly, the investigation will be able to proceed without placing specific suspicion on you as the discoverer. The townspeople will understand that I came to this knowledge through official channels, through professional investigation, through police work." It was not entirely true, and Brennan knew it. The moment Hutchins was identified as the person who had revealed the graves, his life would become infinitely more difficult. Brennan was making an impossible choice easier by presenting a selective version of the truth. He told himself this was justified. He told himself that the search for truth occasionally required the strategic abandonment of other truths. Even as he spoke these justifications in his mind, he wondered whether he was simply convincing himself that his own moral compromises were acceptable in service of a greater good. Hutchins looked at Brennan for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll take you. But I need to tell my wife first. She'll wonder where I've gone, and if she doesn't hear from me by sunset, she might try to leave the area. I need to ensure she stays, that she doesn't flee out of fear." "Of course," Brennan said. "We'll go immediately after you've spoken to her. I'll arrange for my deputy to accompany us. It's important that there be official witnesses to the discovery." But even as he said this, Brennan was thinking about his deputy. The deputy, a man named William Coates, who had lived his entire life in Chatham County, was almost certainly complicit in the concealment of whatever horror existed in those graves. Bringing Coates along would be announcing to the entire community that the investigation was beginning. It would give them time to destroy evidence, to construct protective narratives, to prepare their collective defense. For the first time since arriving in Chatham County, Thomas Brennan understood what he was truly up against. It was not simply the isolated crime of one deranged individual. It was a conspiracy of silence, maintained through violence and intimidation, involving multiple members of the community. It was a social structure built on the concealment of such horrors, and he was going to have to dismantle it with a single deputy who was likely opposed to everything the investigation represented. In a county where the entire social order was constructed to protect the very secrets he was about to begin uncovering. He had accepted this position because he believed in justice. He was beginning to understand that justice in the American South was not simply difficult to obtain. It was violently resisted, systematically rejected, and ultimately sacrificed on the altar of community reputation and social preservation. Justice here was not the default state. It was an act of rebellion. Brennan picked up his coat and his hat. "Let's go," he said to Hutchins. "The sooner we see these graves, the sooner the truth begins to emerge. And once the truth begins to emerge, Mr. Hutchins, there is no power on earth that can suppress it again. It will grow, it will spread, and eventually it will demand reckoning." He did not know if this was true, but he needed to believe it. In that moment, standing in his sparse office above a store in a hostile town, looking at a frightened farmer who had risked everything to speak truth, Brennan needed to believe that truth possessed a power that could not be stopped once it was set in motion. He walked out of his office with Edgar Hutchins into the red clay streets of Riverside, knowing that by nightfall the entire town would know that the investigation had begun. Knowing that by the next morning the machinery of concealment and intimidation would be activated. Knowing that what he was about to see in those unmarked graves would be the beginning of something that could not be undone, and that the cost of that unraveling was going to be far higher than he could possibly imagine. The graves were waiting, 47 of them, each one containing the remains of a woman who had disappeared into the machinery of a slaveholding society, into systems of control and exploitation that had only adapted, not ended, with the abolition of slavery. Each one a testimony to something that the community had decided, collectively, should remain buried and forgotten. But Thomas Brennan was not going to let them stay buried. He could not. Even if it destroyed him, even if it cost him his position, his reputation, his safety, his life. Some things demanded to be brought into the light. Some things demanded to be remembered. The graves revealed their horror gradually, as though the earth itself was reluctant to surrender what it had been made to conceal. Brennan stood at the edge of the fenced enclosure, looking down at the ground with the expression of a man whose profession had long since taught him to see death in all its forms, but whose humanity had never quite adjusted to the sight of it. The smell hit first, soil and decay, but beneath it something chemical that suggested someone had attempted to accelerate decomposition or mask the evidence of what lay beneath. The fence itself was blackened wood, old enough that it had begun to splinter and collapse in places. Through the gaps between the wooden slats, Brennan could see the markers beyond. There were no headstones. There were no carved names. There were only slight depressions in the ground, grass grown over them, and in some places where the soil had washed away, bones visible in the afternoon light. Deputy William Coates stood a short distance away, his face an unreadable mask. Coates was perhaps 50 years old, a man whose family had lived in Chatham County for generations. He had fought in the war on the Confederate side and had returned home to find that the world he had fought for had been destroyed. His loyalties were not to the law or to the principle of justice. His loyalties were to the continuity of his community, to the preservation of its reputation, to the concealment of its deepest sins. Brennan had suspected this about Coates from their first meeting. Now he knew it with absolute certainty. Coates had not wanted to come here. He had argued that it was a waste of the sheriff's time, that there were no credible reports of any graves, that Hutchins was likely confused or exaggerating. It had taken an explicit order, delivered in the presence of the county commissioners, to force Coates to accompany Brennan to the site. Hutchins was digging carefully in one location, marking out what appeared to be the boundaries of a grave with wooden stakes. His hands were visibly shaking. Beside him lay fragments of cloth, the skeletal remains of what might have been a shoe, and several pieces of bone. The bones were clean, not recently buried, but not ancient either. Brennan estimated perhaps 5 to 10 years since burial, though he knew his estimate could be dramatically wrong. The earth kept its own time, and decomposition was not a process that followed predictable schedules. "There's a box," Hutchins called out, his voice tight with suppressed horror. "The remains are in some kind of box. Wood, I think, but it's mostly rotted. I can see the outline." Brennan moved closer, examining the gravesite carefully. Yes, there it was. The remnant of a wooden casket, the kind that would have been used for an enslaved person. Cheap construction, meant to hold the body long enough for burial, but not much longer. Inside the casket, or what remained of it, were the partial remains of a woman. Long bones, delicate structure, fragments of fabric that suggested a dress of simple design, and there, on what remained of a finger bone, a ring. The The same kind of simple brass ring that enslaved women often wore, the kind that could be purchased cheaply by an owner and given to a woman as a form of ownership, as though the ring could bind her more completely to her captivity. "Photograph everything," Brennan said to Coates. "Document every grave. I want measurements, descriptions, sketches. I want this recorded precisely." "We don't have a photographer," Coates said flatly, "and this is all highly irregular. We have no legal authority to be disturbing these graves. If these are unmarked burials, they're likely family graves or, Brennan interrupted, they are evidence of crimes, multiple crimes, murders, in fact, crimes that will require thorough investigation, which is why we are documenting them, which is why you will do as I have instructed." Coates's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He pulled out a notebook and a pencil, but his movements were slow, reluctant, the movements of a man obeying an order he disagreed with and resented. Over the next 8 hours, the full extent of the horror became apparent. Brennan and Hutchins worked systematically through the enclosure, marking each grave, recording its position, noting the condition of the remains. By late afternoon, they had identified and partially excavated 23 graves. Hutchins had said 47, but only 23 were visible enough to document. The other graves had likely been discovered and destroyed by someone who wanted to conceal the evidence, or they were concealed beneath the current ground level, hidden more carefully than the rest. Or perhaps they had never existed. Perhaps Hutchins' count had been an estimate, and the actual number was smaller. But looking at the systematic rows of disturbed earth, Brennan suspected the truth was the opposite. There were more graves, many more. The plantation owners had been operating this cemetery for years. The graves that remained visible were only those that hadn't yet been discovered and destroyed. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as Brennan was examining the 15th grave, he found something that changed everything. A fragment of paper, so degraded that it was nearly transparent, but with writing still faintly visible on its surface. He extracted it with extreme care and unfolded it slowly, aware that too much handling would destroy it completely. The writing was in a careful, educated hand, not the handwriting of someone who had received formal education in a school, but of someone who had taught themselves, practicing letters until they achieved a level of deliberate control and precision. The text was brief, but its implications were enormous. Sarah Owens, born 1848, died 15th of March 1856, resisted, breeding program ceased per colonel's orders, buried in ground, no marker, keep sealed. Brennan stared at the note for a long moment. It was a record, a deliberate record of a woman's death, not created with the intent to preserve her memory, but created to document the fact of her death, to note that she had resisted, whatever that meant in this context, to record that she had been part of a breeding program. The clinical nature of the language, the bureaucratic precision of the documentation, was perhaps more horrifying than any explicit description of violence could have been. This was not the work of a man acting in rage or in momentary passion. This was the work of someone maintaining records, keeping accounts, documenting the results of a systematic program designed for profit. "What is it?" Hutchins asked, seeing Brennan's expression change. Brennan held up the note carefully. "Evidence, documentation. Someone kept records. Someone deliberately wanted a written account of what happened here." Coates had moved closer, drawn by Brennan's tone. His face, when he saw the note, went absolutely white. Brennan watched this reaction carefully. Coates knew something. Coates understood exactly what this note meant, exactly what the breeding program referred to, exactly what Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge had been doing on this property for years. The knowledge was written in his sudden pallor, in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "This is inadmissible," Coates said, his voice tight with tension. "Any evidence you found here has been compromised. The chain of custody has been destroyed. In any legal proceeding, this would be thrown out." "Perhaps," Brennan said, "but we're not in a legal proceeding yet. We're in an investigation, and this is evidence of crimes that appear to have been deliberately concealed by someone with significant power in this county." Over the next 2 hours, as the sun began to set and the cemetery seemed to grow darker despite the fading light, Brennan conducted a systematic search of the main plantation house. It had been abandoned. Colonel Rutledge had died in 1860, and his estate had passed to distant relatives who had apparently wanted nothing to do with the property or its history. The house was partially boarded up, its furnishings covered in dust and decay. But Brennan found what he was looking for in the Colonel's study: ledgers. Detailed ledgers that documented the entire breeding program that had been conducted on Belle River Plantation. Women purchased specifically for breeding, children born to these women, pseudoscientific notes about blood quality and genetic selection, detailed records of deaths with cause listed as disease or natural causes, when in fact the notes suggested something far more sinister than any natural process. The ledger entry for Sarah Owens read, Sarah, age 19, purchased March 1853, origin African, estimated. Breeding cycle, 8 pregnancies in 3 years. Final pregnancy resulted in complications. Subject expired March 1856. Cause, sepsis from childbed fever. Note, subject was resistant to cooperation. Recommended measures resulted in compliance until final illness. Replacement required. Property loss, $1 to $100. Property loss. Sarah Owens, a woman who had been enslaved, forced to become pregnant 8 times in 3 years, had died in agony, and her death was recorded as a property loss of $200. The dehumanization was complete. It had been documented, calculated, justified. Brennan sat with these ledgers in front of him as darkness fell completely. Coates waited outside the study, waiting to see what the sheriff would do with this evidence. Hutchins had gone home to his family, shaken by what he had witnessed. The graves were still open, still waiting. 47 of them, or more, each one a testament to a system of violence so systematic, so deliberate, so thoroughly documented that it transcended simple cruelty. This was not the crime of a madman acting on impulse. This was the crime of a businessman, a man who had calculated value, measured efficiency, documented results, a man who had operated with the absolute assumption that no one would ever be allowed to discover what he had done, because no one in the South possessed the power or the will to hold him accountable. Brennan understood, sitting in that dark study surrounded by the detailed records of systematic sexual violence and murder conducted across 2 decades, what he was truly up against. This was not going to be an investigation where truth naturally led to justice. The power structure of Chatham County had been deliberately built on the concealment of exactly this kind of crime. To expose it would be to expose the complicity of half the county, the judge who had received payments from Rutledge, the sheriff before Brennan, who had been instructed to look the other way, the town doctor who had treated the women and documented their conditions, the overseer who had carried out the colonel's orders, the church minister who had blessed the plantation and never asked uncomfortable questions. All of them had known, or had deliberately chosen not to know. The distance between knowledge and willful ignorance was vanishingly small. By bringing these ledgers to light, by forcing a proper investigation, Brennan was not simply solving a crime. He was dismantling a system that had taken decades to construct. He was threatening the reputation and the financial security of families that had built their wealth on exactly these practices. He was ensuring that enemies would be made, that threats would be issued, that pressure would be applied from every direction. He was ensuring, in essence, that his own future in Chatham County had become precarious. He was, fundamentally, beginning a war against an entire community's carefully constructed mythology about itself. Brennan picked up one of the ledgers and walked out of the study. Coates was waiting on the porch, his hand resting on his gun in a way that might have been casual or might have been a deliberate threat. The ambiguity itself was part of the message. "I'm taking these ledgers to be secured," Brennan said. "They are evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. If you attempt to prevent this, you will be charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence of capital crimes." "You can't do this," Coates said, but his voice carried no conviction. "This is county property. The authority of the county sheriff includes investigating crimes and preserving evidence," Brennan finished. "Which is what I am doing. Stay out of my way, Deputy Coates, or you will find yourself answering questions you don't want to answer about how much you knew and how much you deliberately concealed, questions that could have serious legal consequences." Brennan turned and walked back toward his horse, the ledgers in his arms. Behind him, he could hear the wind moving through the open graves of Belle River Plantation. 47 women, 8 pregnancies each, Sarah Owens. and probably 46 others whose names had been carefully recorded in Colonel Rutledge's ledgers, whose lives had been stolen, whose deaths had been documented with the same clinical precision that a farmer might use to record the death of livestock. The investigation had begun. Brennan knew that by morning, the entire community would know what he had found. He knew that pressure would be applied from multiple directions. He knew that witnesses would suddenly become unavailable or would recant their statements. He knew that the county commissioners would demand that the investigation be shut down, that the evidence be declared inadmissible, that the whole ugly business be buried again, permanently this time. But he held the ledgers. The records existed. The graves were documented. 47 women had been transformed from mere statistics into names, into identities, into evidence that a crime, not a sin, not a mistake, but a crime had been committed. That evidence could not be undone. That evidence would demand reckoning, even if the reckoning took years, even if it destroyed his career, even if it cost him his life. Some truths, once unearthed, could not be buried again. They would lie on the surface, exposed to light, demanding accountability. The question was whether Chatham County was willing to face that truth, or whether it would spend everything it had to keep it hidden, to maintain the fiction that such horrors had never occurred, to preserve the reputation of powerful men at the cost of erasing the memory of dead women. Brennan suspected he already knew the answer, but he was going to pursue the truth anyway, whatever the cost. By morning, Brennan knew, the entire county would have heard some version of the story. In small towns, secrets travel faster than truth, and rumors move even faster than secrets. The question was not whether people would know what he had found, but how the story would be transformed in the retelling. By the time it reached the courthouse, the graves might have become a family cemetery from the 1840s. By the time it reached the churches, Sarah Owens might have become a servant who died of natural causes. By the time it reached the plantation owners' parlors, the ledgers might have become old records of questionable authenticity. This was how communities protected themselves, not through the direct suppression of truth, but through the gradual corruption of it, the addition of alternative explanations, the introduction of doubt until doubt became certainty. Brennan did not sleep that night. He sat in his office with the ledgers in front of him, making copies by candlelight. His handwriting was precise and careful. Each entry had to be documented, each name preserved, each number recorded. He understood that he was engaged in a race now, not against Coates or against other deputies, but against time itself. The community had hours, at most days, to decide how to respond to this discovery. They could cooperate, allow the investigation to proceed, accept that justice would require accountability, or they could move to bury the evidence, to discredit him, to make the investigation impossible. Based on what he had learned about Chatham County in his weeks there, Brennan suspected he already knew what they would choose. It came faster than expected. By 9 o'clock in the morning, a delegation arrived at his office. Judge William Ashford, who controlled the judicial system of the county. Colonel Marcus Henley, the wealthiest plantation owner in the region, his face set in an expression of cold authority. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, the pastor of the primary church, his hands clasped as though in constant prayer, and Thomas Sutton, the county commissioner, who represented the interests of the business community. These were the men who had arranged Brennan's appointment. These were the men who had believed they could control him, could channel his enforcement of the law in directions that would strengthen rather than threaten the established order. Now they had come to negotiate, and Brennan understood immediately that they had decided the terms would not be acceptable. "Sheriff Brennan," Judge Ashford began, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a man attempting to convince someone of something both parties already knew to be false. "We have become aware of certain discoveries you made yesterday at the abandoned Rutledge property. We want you to understand that, while we appreciate your diligence, there are significant complications with the investigation you appear to be pursuing." "Complications?" Brennan repeated, meeting his gaze. "Do you mean legal complications, or do you mean complications for the reputation of this county?" "Both," Colonel Henley said, his voice harder than the judge's. "You must understand, Sheriff, that Chatham County is in a delicate position. The war has left us economically devastated. The presence of federal troops, the disruptions of the Freedmen's Administration, the chaos of Reconstruction, we are barely holding the social order together. What you discovered yesterday, if made public, would create enormous turmoil. There would be investigations, there would be accusations, there would be a complete collapse of the trust between the races. There is already no trust between the races, Brennan said quietly. There is only the reality that white Chatham County has built its wealth on systematic violence, and black Chatham County has learned to survive by not mentioning it. You're asking me not to mention it either. Reverend Blackwood leaned forward, his hands clasped as though in prayer or pleading. You are not being reasonable, Sheriff. Colonel Rutledge is dead. He cannot be held accountable. The women involved, may they rest in peace, they are gone. Digging up their graves, broadcasting the ugliest aspects of our region's history, will serve no purpose except to create pain and division. Where is the mercy in that? Where is the Christian charity? Christian charity, Brennan said, would suggest that giving names to the murdered women, documenting their deaths, acknowledging the crimes committed against them, these would be appropriate responses. But I suspect you're asking me not for Christian charity, but for silence. You're asking me to pretend I never found the graves, never read the ledgers, never learned that Sarah Owens was forced to bear 8 children in 3 years before dying of sepsis. You're asking me to pretend none of this happened. The room went silent. Brennan had spoken the name. He had stated the specific horror. He had made it impossible to speak in generalities about unfortunate circumstances or regrettable aspects of a system now abolished. We are asking you, Judge Ashford said carefully, his voice tighter now, to consider whether the pursuit of this matter is truly in the best interest of Chatham County. The Freedmen's Bureau would become involved. Federal investigators would arrive. The result would be years of legal proceedings, enormous expense, and ultimately, because, let us be frank, you would be unlikely to secure convictions for crimes committed against enslaved people by a man now deceased. The legal system does not provide for prosecuting the dead, Sheriff. All you would accomplish would be to reopen old wounds for no purpose. Old wounds, Brennan said. You mean systematic rape. You mean systematic murder. Those are the wounds you're referring to? The wounds that never healed because they were never acknowledged? We prefer to think of them as regrettable aspects of a system that has now been abolished, Colonel Henley said, his tone becoming sharper, more direct. The slaves are freed. Whatever occurred during slavery, while morally ambiguous perhaps, was legal at the time. Prosecuting the dead solves nothing. Brennan stood and walked to the window of his office. Below, the red clay streets of Riverside were beginning to fill with people. Word had spread. People were gathering in small groups, watching his office, their faces turned upward with expressions he could not quite read from this distance. By noon, he thought, there would be a crowd. By evening, there might be a mob. I am going to continue this investigation, Brennan said, still facing the window. I am going to document every grave. I am going to preserve the ledgers as evidence. I am going to submit my findings to the federal authorities. What happens from there is not my decision to make, but I will not pretend that systematic sexual violence and murder did not occur. I will not participate in a community conspiracy to forget. He turned to face them. You should understand that you are not protected by your position, Judge Ashford said. His tone had changed now, no longer reasonable, now simply cold. The cold of a man delivering threats in the language of bureaucracy. Sheriffs can be recalled. Sheriffs can have their reputations destroyed. Sheriffs can have accidents. The Reconstruction era is a chaotic time. Many officials appointed by Northern authorities have found that the burden of their positions became too great. Some have chosen to resign. Others have found themselves unable to continue. It was a threat, delivered in language so formal that it might have been mistaken for conversation if Brennan had not understood exactly what was being suggested. The men were not asking anymore. They were warning him. They were making clear that resistance would have consequences. When they left his office, they left in silence. There were no further negotiations, no promises, no attempts to persuade. There was only the cold certainty that Brennan had aligned himself against the power structure of Chatham County, and that the power structure would respond accordingly. Over the next week, everything Brennan had feared came to pass. Deputy Coates submitted his resignation in a letter, claiming he could no longer work with a sheriff who showed such disrespect for local traditions and community stability. His words were carefully chosen. They appeared to be about management style, but were actually a public signal that the deputy was distancing himself from Brennan. The county commissioners called a special meeting and voted to suspend Brennan's authority. pending an investigation into his abuse of office and destabilizing activities. Judge Ashford began proceedings to declare the evidence Brennan had collected inadmissible, arguing that it had been obtained through improper search without a warrant and without proper chain of custody. The town doctor sent a letter to the newspaper claiming that the graves had likely been in use since the 1820s and probably contained the remains of enslaved people who had died of natural causes: cholera, typhoid, malaria, common killers in rural areas. The minister began preaching sermons about the importance of forgiveness and the danger of dredging up old wounds that, while painful, serve no constructive purpose in the present. But the most dangerous development came from a different direction. On the Thursday of the second week, Brennan was approached by a man named Samuel Voss. Voss was a federal agent, sent to Chatham County ostensibly to monitor Reconstruction-era compliance and protect freedmen from violence. In reality, Voss had been compromised early in his tenure. He had accepted bribes from the local power structure, had turned a blind eye to violations of Freedmen's Bureau protocols, and had become essentially a tool of the very people he was supposed to oversee. Now he came to Brennan with an offer that was both tempting and threatening. "The investigation into the Rutledge plantation can be closed," Voss said, his voice matter-of-fact and professional. "I have authority to declare the matter resolved. The evidence can be sealed. You can continue as sheriff. Your authority will be restored. Your position will be secure. All of this can simply end." "In exchange for what?" Brennan asked. "In exchange for the evidence being handed over to me, for your agreement to cease investigation, and for your silence regarding this matter. The graves will be properly resealed. A proper burial ceremony will be conducted. The women will be honored in death in a way that doesn't require public scandal." "A scandal that documents their murders, you mean," Brennan said. "A scandal that forces accountability for systematic crimes." "A scandal that would destroy this entire county," Voss corrected. "A scandal that would bring federal investigators here for years. A scandal that would make it impossible to establish any sort of functioning government in Chatham County. You have to understand, Sheriff, that sometimes the price of peace is accepting that not all crimes can be prosecuted. Sometimes it is accepting that justice is not achieved through the legal system, but through other means." "Through forgetting, you mean," Brennan said. "Justice through deliberate erasure." "If you prefer," Voss said. He placed a leather folder on Brennan's desk with deliberate care. "Think about what I'm offering you. Think about what you'll lose if you refuse. I'll return tomorrow for your answer, but I should tell you, if you refuse, I have been authorized to take possession of all the evidence you have collected. Federal authority supersedes county authority in Reconstruction investigations. The evidence will be sealed regardless. Your cooperation would simply ensure that you are not destroyed in the process." It was, Brennan understood, both an offer and a final threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. Take it, and he survived, but became complicit in the erasure of crimes. Refuse it, and his evidence would be confiscated anyway, and he would have made an enemy of the federal government itself, the one institution that theoretically had the power to protect him. That night, Brennan sat alone in his office. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. Not the ledgers, not official documents, but his own words, his own account of what he had found, what he had learned, the names, the numbers, the specific horrors documented in clinical language by men who had seen slavery not as a moral evil, but as a business proposition. He wrote, Sarah Owens, age 19, born 1848. 8 pregnancies in 3 years. Died March 15, 1856. The cause was listed as childbed fever, but the ledger notes indicate that resistance to cooperation had been addressed through recommended measures. She was a human being. She was murdered through systematic sexual violence and medical negligence. Her name was Sarah Owens. She was 19 years old. He wrote the same for the names he could identify: Margaret Collins, Catherine Williams, Jane Henderson, Martha Adams. Woman after woman, name after name, transforming statistics into individual tragedy. Then he made his decision. He did something that the community had not expected, something that violated all the unspoken rules about what was supposed to remain hidden. He sent copies north, to the offices of the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, to anti-slavery journals that had survived the war and continued to publish accounts of slavery's crimes, to abolitionists who had spent their lives fighting slavery and would recognize the significance of what he had discovered, to the state archives, and most crucially, to the one institution that could preserve the historical record even if the local machinery of justice chose to suppress it, the Library of Congress. He was not going to let the graves disappear into silence, even if the investigation was closed, even if the evidence was seized, even if he was removed from his position. Someone, somewhere, would know what had happened at Belle River Plantation. Someone, somewhere, would have the documentation. Someone, somewhere, would be able to tell the story. When Voss returned the next day, Brennan handed over the original ledgers. They were placed carefully in the agent's leather case. The official receipt was signed. The investigation was closed. The graves were sealed. But Voss did not know that copies existed in archives throughout the North. Voss did not know that the story had been sent to journalists, to historians, to institutions that would preserve it. Voss did not understand that while he had confiscated the physical evidence, he had not confiscated the knowledge, the documentation, the historical record. Brennan had learned in his weeks in Chatham County that the only power that could not be seized was the power of other people knowing the truth. 2 months later, Brennan was relieved of his position. The official reason given was incompatibility with local community values. The real reason was that he had refused to forget, had refused to accept the community's preferred narrative of silence. Coates was appointed as his replacement, a man who understood perfectly what was and was not supposed to be investigated, what should remain hidden beneath the red clay soil of Chatham County. But by then, the documentation had begun to circulate in the North. Abolition newspapers published accounts of the graves. The Freedmen's Bureau began informal inquiries, though these were quickly suppressed by Voss and others compromised by local money. Historians began documenting the pattern. By the 1870s, when the graves were finally lost to erosion and deliberate destruction, multiple copies of Brennan's evidence existed in archives throughout the country. The graves had been made to disappear from Chatham County, but they could not be made to disappear from history. Sarah Owens had a name. The other 46 women had names, or at least the names that could be found in the ledgers. Their stories had been preserved not by the machinery of official justice, which had failed them completely, but by one man's refusal to accept that some crimes should remain hidden, by one man's understanding that history is written not only by those in power, but by those with the courage to preserve what those in power want to forget. The question that would echo through Chatham County for generations to come was whether the machinery of justice would ever be allowed to function, whether reckoning would ever come, whether the documented crimes would ever be prosecuted. The answer, in the end, was no. The Civil War had ended slavery. Reconstruction had ended, bringing with it the end of federal protection. And in that vacuum, a community had made its choice. Forgetting was worth more than justice. The reputation of the county was worth more than the memory of the murdered women. But the graves remained. Even when they were physically destroyed, even when they disappeared from the earth, they remained in archives, they remained in documentation, they remained in the historical record, waiting for a future generation to finally look them in the face and decide whether Chatham County, whether the American South, whether America itself was ready to acknowledge what had been done. 132 years after Thomas Brennan was relieved of his position in Chatham County, a young historian named Dr. Rebecca Chen stood in the Special Collections reading room of the Library of Congress, holding a folder of yellowed documents. The folder was labeled Brennan Collection, Chatham County, South Carolina, 1863-1864. Inside were transcriptions in Brennan's careful handwriting, ledger entries from Belle River Plantation, detailed descriptions of graves and names. Sarah Owens, Margaret Collins, Catherine Williams, Jane Henderson, Martha Adams. 37 women whose names had been recovered from the historical record, whose stories had been preserved through one man's deliberate refusal to let them disappear into the silence of institutional erasure. Chen had been conducting research on Reconstruction-era investigations into slavery crimes when she stumbled upon the collection almost by accident. It had been sitting in the Library of Congress for more than a century, buried in a box labeled Miscellaneous Reconstruction-Era Documents. Most scholars of Chatham County, and there were not many, had never discovered it. The The surviving courthouse records made no mention of an investigation into Belle River Plantation. The county histories, written decades later by descendants of the perpetrators, glossed over Colonel Rutledge with a single sentence. Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge, prominent planter, died in 1860. The official record had succeeded, almost completely in erasing the story. Almost. The almost was everything. Chen began to trace the documentation systematically. She contacted the Freedmen's Bureau archives in Washington. She searched anti-slavery journals from the 1860s and found an unsigned article published in 1864 describing a systematic breeding program on a South Carolina plantation, recently discovered by county authorities and subsequently suppressed by institutional power. She searched university archives throughout the country. At Yale, in collections of abolitionist papers, she found copies of Brennan's reports. At Princeton, in the William Still collection, the archives of the man who had dedicated his life to helping enslaved people escape, she found a letter from Brennan. In that letter, Brennan described the graves and the investigation, and he asked Still to preserve the documentation because the official machinery of justice has been compromised and corrupted, and truth must be preserved by means outside official channels. What emerged was a fragmented but undeniable historical record. Thomas Brennan had succeeded in his essential task. He had made it impossible for the crimes to disappear completely. The graves themselves were gone, destroyed by erosion, deliberate obliteration, and a century of cultivation. The original ledgers had been sealed in federal archives and lost to history, likely destroyed. But the copies, the transcriptions, the descriptions, the names, these had survived. These had been preserved across multiple institutions. These existed in archives throughout the country, waiting for someone with the dedication and the historical training to find them. Chen's discovery of the Brennan collection forced a historical reckoning that should have occurred decades earlier. She published a monograph titled Preserved in Archives: The Invisible Investigation of Belle River Plantation. The book, while scholarly and academic in its approach, began to circulate beyond academic circles. Other historians began to look more carefully at Reconstruction-era suppression. They began to ask difficult questions about how many investigations had been systematically shut down, how many sheriffs had been removed from office for pursuing justice, how many crimes had been officially buried. The documentation from Belle River Plantation became a case study in how institutional systems operate to conceal crimes, and how documentation becomes the only reliable form of resistance when official justice has failed. But historical reckoning was only one form of memory. In 2010, 147 years after Brennan first stood at the edge of the cemetery at Belle River Plantation, a journalist named Marcus Williams learned about the story from Chen's work. Williams was himself descended from a woman who had been enslaved in South Carolina. His great-great-grandmother had managed to escape slavery through the Underground Railroad and had settled in Pennsylvania, carrying with her memories of a family member left behind. Family stories passed down through generations spoke of a relative who had not made it out, who had disappeared into the plantation system, and whose name had been lost to time. Williams began to trace the Belle River Plantation story with the intensity of someone searching for a family member. He contacted local historical societies in Chatham County. He found that the plantation house still stood, though it had been converted into a private residence decades earlier. He found that the cemetery, if physical traces still remained, was likely located on private land and would require permission to access. He found that Chatham County's official history had completely erased any mention of Brennan's investigation. But he also found something unexpected: descendants of Thomas Brennan himself. Brennan had never married. He had never had children of his own, but he had a great-great-nephew, now in his 90s, who lived in South Carolina. This great-great-nephew, Thomas Brennan III, had inherited a folder of documents that his family had preserved through 6 generations with deliberate care. His father had told him to keep these documents safe. That father had been told by his own father, creating a chain of knowledge that stretched back unbroken to the original Thomas Brennan. In that folder were letters between Brennan and his sister, in which he described the investigation in detail. In that folder was a photograph of Belle River Plantation, taken sometime in the 1880s. In that folder was Brennan's own final account, a personal statement, of what had happened and what it meant. When Marcus Williams and Thomas Brennan III met for the first time, they stood together at the location where the cemetery had once existed, at Belle River Plantation. The place had been identified through careful research, by tracing Brennan's original measurements against modern surveys and land records. The graves themselves were no longer visible. The land had been plowed repeatedly over a century and a half, the earth reshaped by weather and agriculture. The physical markers had vanished. But Williams and Brennan knew what had been buried there: 47 women, 8 pregnancies each. Sarah Owens, age 19, who had died of sepsis in 1856, and 46 others whose names had been preserved in archives and now existed in the historical record. "My great-great-grandfather understood something that most people never learn," Thomas Brennan III said, standing on the empty field. He understood that if he could not get justice through the courts, he could preserve the truth for history. He spent his entire life believing that someday someone would care enough to look, that someone would find what he had preserved, and that when they did, the truth would matter. Marcus Williams felt the weight of that moment. He was standing on a piece of land where women he was distantly related to had been murdered. He was standing on a piece of land where crimes had been systematically concealed by institutional power. He was standing on a piece of land where one man's refusal to accept silence had created a possibility, a small but genuine possibility, that truth would eventually emerge and be acknowledged. In 2011, Marcus Williams published a book titled Buried and Preserved: The Hidden History of Belle River Plantation. The book combined rigorous historical research, family history and genealogy, and ethical reflection on how we remember and memorialize crimes committed against enslaved people. The book reached beyond academic circles. It was discussed on public radio. It was reviewed in major historical journals. It found an audience of people who wanted to understand how institutional silence operates and how documentation can resist it. But more importantly, it sparked local action in Chatham County. Descendants of both the enslaved women and of the Rutledge family began to engage, sometimes reluctantly, with this history. Some resisted. There were still people in the county who believed that dredging up such history served no purpose except to create division. But others, particularly younger residents of the county and descendants educated outside the county, began to ask questions about their own family's involvement. Some discovered that their ancestors had been directly complicit in the crimes. Others discovered that their ancestors had known about the crimes and had deliberately chosen to look away, to participate in the systematic silence. In 2015, 52 years after Marcus Williams first learned the story of Belle River Plantation, Chatham County commissioned a historical marker to be placed at the site. The marker read, "In 1863, a cemetery containing the remains of approximately 47 enslaved women was discovered on this property. These women had been systematically exploited and subjected to forced pregnancies as part of a deliberate breeding program conducted by Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge. Investigation into these crimes was initiated but subsequently suppressed by local and federal authorities. The names of the women, their individual lives, and their deaths have been recovered through historical research and are now preserved in archives. Their memory deserves to be acknowledged and honored." The dedication ceremony drew 100 people on a gray afternoon. Some came to honor the memory of the women who had died there. Others came out of curiosity or family obligation. Others came because they believed that acknowledging their family's complicity was an act of moral responsibility. And a small number came because they believed that historical truth was important, that memory was a form of justice when legal justice had failed, and that acknowledging crimes was the necessary first step toward building a society where similar crimes would not be repeated. Thomas Brennan III attended the ceremony, though by then he was in his 90s and increasingly frail. He sat quietly and listened as people spoke about the women whose names had been recovered from the documentary record. He listened as people acknowledged what had happened on that land. He wept, though not for the reasons one might expect. He did not weep because the injustice had finally been fully addressed, which it had not. He did not weep because anyone had ever been prosecuted for the crimes, because no one ever was. The perpetrator was long dead, and the institutional actors who had suppressed the investigation were long deceased or forgotten. He wept because his great-great-grandfather's faith that truth would eventually matter had been vindicated. After 152 years, the graves had been remembered. The names had been preserved and acknowledged. History had not completely erased the story, but the marker raised difficult questions that no dedication ceremony could adequately resolve. Why had it taken 152 years for the county to acknowledge what had happened? Why had it required a descendant of an enslaved woman and a descendant of the man who had investigated the crimes coming together to force the community to acknowledge what had been known, or deliberately hidden, all along? Why did Chatham County have to be confronted by journalists and historians before it would acknowledge crimes that had been thoroughly documented for more than a century in archives? These questions pointed to a deeper historical truth. That memory is not automatic. Truth does not naturally emerge from the past. Justice does not occur simply because evidence exists. Someone has to care enough to preserve documentation. Someone has to care enough to find it. Someone has to care enough to demand that it be acknowledged and integrated into the community's understanding of itself. When any of these elements fail, crimes can be buried so completely that it takes generations, perhaps centuries, to unearth them, if they are ever unearthed at all. Thomas Brennan had understood this fundamental truth. He had understood, sitting in his office in Chatham County in 1863, that official justice would fail. He had understood that the only power available to him was the power to preserve, to document, to make it impossible for truth to be completely erased. He had succeeded, but at a cost. He had lost his position as sheriff. He had lost his reputation and his livelihood in Chatham County. He had lost the opportunity for legal justice. He had won something far more fragile and harder to achieve. He had won the possibility of historical memory. By the time the marker was dedicated in 2015, Thomas Brennan had been dead for more than a century. He never lived to see his efforts bear fruit. He never knew that the copies he had sent north would eventually be discovered. He never knew that historians would find his documentation and that his name would be associated with the effort to recover the truth about Belle River Plantation. He only knew, in his final years before his death, that he had done everything he could to preserve the documentation. He could only trust that someday someone would care enough to find it, and that when they did, the truth would matter. And someone had. Multiple someones, in fact. Rebecca Chen, who discovered the Brennan collection in the Library of Congress. Marcus Williams, who conducted the historical research and published the story. Thomas Brennan III, who had preserved his ancestors' legacy across 6 generations. And thousands of readers who learned the story and understood its meaning, that crimes committed in darkness can be brought into light if someone refuses to allow them to disappear. That documentation is a form of resistance. That archives are sites of justice when courts have failed. That memory is a way of honoring the dead when other forms of accountability are impossible or have been denied. The question that now faced America was whether Chatham County's delayed acknowledgement of the crimes at Belle River Plantation was an isolated historical case or whether it represented a broader pattern. How many other plantations had conducted similar breeding programs? How many other investigations had been suppressed? How many other names had been lost to history because documentation had not been preserved? The fragmented evidence in the Brennan collection suggested that similar crimes had occurred elsewhere, and that similar institutional suppression had likely followed. But the documentation for those other crimes might never have been preserved. The archives might have been destroyed. The historians and journalists who eventually cared enough to search might never find what they were looking for. This was the final tragedy of slavery. Not only the crimes themselves, but the systematic erasure that followed, the deliberate destruction of evidence and the institutional suppression of memory. And this was the final triumph of Thomas Brennan, that he had fought against that erasure, even when it cost him everything. He had understood that preserving truth is a form of power. He had understood that documentation is a form of resistance. He had understood that history is written not only by those with power in the present, but by those with the courage and commitment to preserve evidence for the future. In the end, what Thomas Brennan achieved was not legal justice. The women who died at Belle River Plantation never received justice through the courts. The perpetrators were never prosecuted. The community of Chatham County never faced legal consequences for the institutional suppression of Brennan's investigation. But what he achieved was something that might, in the long run, be more important than legal justice, even as that statement pains anyone committed to justice. He had ensured that the crimes could not be completely erased from history. He had ensured that the women could not be forgotten. He had ensured that future generations would know the truth, and knowing the truth is the first step toward building a different future. It is the foundation upon which meaningful reckoning can be built. It is the basis for preventing similar crimes and for recognizing the patterns of institutional silence. It is the possibility of historical justice, which is the only form of justice available when legal justice has failed or been deliberately suppressed. The graves at Belle River Plantation remain unmarked in the soil, but they are remembered in archives. They are remembered in historical markers. They are remembered in the consciousness of those who have learned their story. And as long as they are remembered in the historical record, the women who died there are not truly forgotten. As long as their names are preserved and spoken, they have a presence in history that no amount of institutional silence could ever completely erase. This is what Thomas Brennan won for Sarah Owens and the 46 others. Not legal justice, perhaps, but memory. And for those denied everything else by slavery and its brutal aftermath, memory is something sacred. Memory is a form of resistance. Memory is how history honors the dead when all else has failed.